Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Kayla Musil. I'm the program manager of the Grand Rapids 2030 district. We are really excited to have Allison Sutter and Hannah Miller here with us today to talk about the new City of Grand Rapids community-wide greenhouse gas inventory. Allison is with the Office of Sustainability and Performance Management with the City of Grand Rapids, and Hannah is the program officer with ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. So a quick housekeeping thing for us today. There's the chat feature and the Q&A feature. Go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're coming from, and then just try to keep your questions to the Q&A. Hannah will have 2 spots within her presentation to stop and go over any questions. So that'll just keep us a little bit more organized as we take those little breaks. And then there will be another Q&A session at the end as well. So the Grand Rapids 2030 district is one of the partners on this E.H.Zero work with the City of Grand Rapids and the Urban Core Collective, with the WEGI Foundation being our primary funder. And we want to give a huge thank you to our visionary supporters, DTE, Consumers Energy, Eagle, and the WEGI Foundation. We can't do this work without you, so we are very grateful. And then here's the agenda, not super set in stone, but Allison's going to give a few remarks, and then Hannah will give the presentation. I think Allison's going to jump back in before that last Q&A session as well. So I will kick it over to Allison.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Good morning to everyone. I am so excited to be here today and to have this presentation. This has been an awesome amount of work that's very informative, and this is the first time that we're sharing some of the information today. So excited to get your feedback and the questions that you might have, but just wanted to start up again like Kayla and just give appreciation out to both the Urban Core Collective and the 2030 district, serving as our key partners for our E.H.Zero work, which this is a webinar being hosted through. Also wanted to just note that I'm very appreciative of the City of Grand Rapids City Commission, as well as our city leadership, particularly City Manager Mark Washington. The City Commission has identified climate change as one of the key areas of focus for the City of Grand Rapids in fiscal year 23, which we're currently in. So really appreciate the support and the understanding of the importance and priority of climate change to our city leadership. Big thank you to ICLEI and Hannah. She's been doing an amazing job with lots of questions and helping with a lot of our partners collecting data. So along those lines, the data partners in particular, there have been a lot, but I really just want to make sure to note DTE Energy, Consumers Energy, and Vicinity, who have been working with us to make sure that we are working with actual data for all of the accounts off of the City of Grand Rapids. So this is really amazing, not to be working with estimates of data, but to actually have that real data to create what our emissions footprint is across the entire City of Grand Rapids community. A few shout outs to some teams. So Office of Sustainability, collaboration is one of our core values at the city, and we're very collaborative across our team. So just wanted to give a shout out. Annabelle Wilkinson is our Environmental and Climate Justice Specialist. I believe she's on this morning, as well as Jen Spiller is our Healthy and Sustainable Building Policy Specialist in leading the city's work on E.H.Zero. And I've got to look, but I think I even saw and was planning to give a shout out to João Oliveira and Mike Daisy, who are 2 former people that were with the city and have done an amazing amount of work to help with a lot of this data in the past, and a lot of the analysis that we've been doing, particularly to understand the city's municipal footprint and our emissions inventory that we're at. So, you know, this isn't something that comes without cost, and it's something that the City of Grand Rapids, as a part of my budget, we you know, invested in because we understood how important it was to have an understanding, and E.H.Zero contributed to this as well, recognizing that buildings, as you will see, make up a large component of the emissions footprint across our community. And so I think that it's really important, and I'm excited about this. I know we've had lots of conversations about setting goals and establishing goals for the community and being held accountable and tracking that. And at the city, we work and really prioritize to be data informed in our decision making. And so this is really a key piece of understanding not only what is our total emissions footprint, but in particular, understanding where those emissions are coming from, so that collectively we can all start talking about what opportunities do we have to start driving emissions down within each of those respective sectors. So with that, I'm excited. I'm going to turn it over to Hannah and let her take us through the analysis and recommendations that ICLEI has done on behalf of the city of Grand Rapids.
Good morning, everyone. Like Allison said, my name is Hannah Miller. I'm a program officer here at ICLEI USA. So just a little bit about ICLEI. We are an international nonprofit that's housed within the United Nations, and we help local governments all across the globe. And then I work in our USA office, so across the nation, to help on reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. I hail from 20 minutes south of Green Bay, so I do bleed green and gold. My apologies. But I appreciate all of the Midwest love out here that we have. I'm going to share my screen, but then also I did recently just finish my master's with CU Boulder, where I studied urban resilience and sustainability. And I've been with ICLEI now starting in February. And like Allison said, I am a program officer here, and I've been working with the city pretty diligently now on finishing up their community-wide greenhouse gas inventory. Again, huge shout out for everyone who's been involved in this project. We all know that making data-driven decisions is extremely crucial to helping for emission reductions in the future. So jumping right in, also, I'm going to be talking a lot. If you have any questions or anything whatsoever, please pop into the chat and or Q&A, and Allison, feel free to jump in for any clarifying points as well. And we'll get started today. So we're going to be going over the City of Grand Rapids community-wide greenhouse gas inventory, our overview and results, and we will get started. So I have just a short agenda today. We're going to go over greenhouse gas and inventory 101, just as a basis to cover everything from the get-go. We're going to go over why an inventory and forecasting is of importance. We're going to go over the specific inventory results. We're going to go over science-based targets and high-impact actions for Grand Rapids. And then we're going to address some key takeaways and principles. So what is a greenhouse gas? So we say GHG for short. So gases that act like glass in a greenhouse. This is trapping the sun's heat near the Earth's surface. And greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are largely responsible for changing our climate. So if we look at this graphic right here, we see how it's outlining the greenhouse gas effect. So we see solar radiation is reflected by the Earth in the atmosphere. We see that most radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface and warms that Earth's surface. We see infrared radiation is emitted by the Earth's surface as well. So we see how the gas comes in, some is trapped, and some escapes. Some of the infrared radiation passes through the atmosphere, some is absorbed and re-emitted in all directions by the greenhouse gas molecules, and the effect of this is to warm the Earth's surface and lower the atmosphere. With more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we are experiencing higher temperatures and or warming of the overall Earth. So we have primary types of greenhouse gases, so it isn't all carbon dioxide. However, carbon dioxide, or CO2, is the largest known greenhouse gas. So we see here, we have the greenhouse gases labeled on the left with the global warming potentials labeled here on the right. For every 1 molecule of carbon dioxide, that equals 1. For every methane, or CH4, that equates to 28 carbon dioxide molecules. Then we have nitrous oxide, or N2O. Every 1 molecule of nitrous oxide accounts for 265 molecules of CO2. So by converting these gases to the equivalents of CO2, we're able to compare across these top greenhouse gases in what we call CO2e, which makes comparing the different emitting sources very, very easy. It allows us to compare different actions and activities of these different gases and allows them to be comparable. We also have different gases that we have here. We have hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. We don't address these nearly as much, and you'll see that it varies based on the type, but we have those different global warming potentials as well. And then, so GHG emissions are typically reported as carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, which allows us to compare those different gases across all our different sectors. So now we're going to talk about greenhouse gas inventory scopes. So I just want to mention this caveat right now. ICLEI, in general, we're starting to move away from a scope discussion. This scopes tend to help or have people think of greenhouse gases in a more abstract form. We are starting to move into an area where we want to start addressing just activity. However, I do think it's important to address scopes. So if we have scope 1, think of that as your direct emissions. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions from electricity consumption. And scope 3 is all other indirect emissions, such as exported waste, out of boundary transportation, etc. So one thing that truthfully, even I use to this day when I think about scopes is this graphic right here. It really helps show what your direct sources, your indirect sources, and all other indirect sources are, and really helps frame a picture of what those different scopes entail and those activities that they're drawn to. And then we have other information only or optional items. So that would include biofuels, ozone depleting substances, carbon offsets, and RECs. So those are not included within the scope discussion.
Hannah, can you give a couple of examples? Because I know you guys helped me understand when we think about particularly the airport and how we did include some of the emissions associated with the airport, which technically falls outside of City of Grand Rapids boundaries, right? And we've talked a little bit about our water utility, which is physically located outside of the city. So maybe just provide a couple of examples there, because I found that really helpful.
Absolutely. So if we're talking about aviation transportation, for example, we can see that that is labeled right down here within scope 3. And that is simply if you guys have the airport within Grand Rapids boundaries, but you are accounting for transportation that's going out and then back in, we want to make sure we're accounting for those emissions related to trips that are directly coming to and from Grand Rapids. And then when we're thinking about our water utility, so if the water utility is located outside of your jurisdictional boundary, it's important that we account for those emissions related to the supply and consumption of Grand Rapids residents, to account for those indirect emissions that we are receiving from a source that is located outside your jurisdictional boundary. Jurisdictional boundaries and everything like that, along with the scope discussion, can get really tricky to try and visualize. So if anyone has any additional questions about like why we included something and or why we didn't include something else and or why it's labeled in a certain way, you're welcome to email me. You're welcome to ask any questions about that as well. So then we move on. So what is in a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory? So although a community-wide greenhouse gas inventories do not necessarily include all of these activities, these are the large majority of emissions generating activities that are included. So Grand Rapids includes all of these areas. So we have stationary energy use, for example, buildings. So we include electricity consumption, natural gas consumption, and then any other fuels such as propane, kerosene, etc. Then we look at mobile fuel use. So we have gas and diesel for vehicles and then also off-road equipment. Then we look at industrial processes, solid waste decomposition and combustion, wastewater treatment, agriculture, forestry, and land use. So within Grand Rapids, there is a small portion of electricity that is contributed to agriculture. And then within your inventory, we used what we call the Learn tool, which accounts for the amount of sequestration that is occurring within Grand Rapids boundaries. So we'll see when we get into a further discussion on exactly what's in the inventory, you guys will be able to see how much sequestration is occurring within Grand Rapids. Then we also address process and fugitive emissions. So process and fugitive emissions is when we take the aggregated use of natural gas that's included in residential energy, commercial energy, industrial energy, and then sometimes it's if it's labeled as transport, that is into commercial and or industrial. We take that aggregated natural gas usage, apply it to a process and fugitive emissions calculator, which then takes a standardized leakage rate. So and applies those emissions to the full community-wide usage. So in essence, we are taking all of the natural gas usage, adding that up together, applying a standard leakage rate, so accounting for all of the transportation and infrastructure within Grand Rapids, and seeing how much natural gas emissions are emitted through the process of simply transporting that natural gas to the sources in which it's used. So within the Grand Rapids community-wide inventory, we see that process and fugitive emissions is around 1 to 2% of the total wide inventory. And then natural gas usage in and of itself is 32% of the complete inventory, which we'll get into in a further discussion when I have everything laid out. But I just want to mention that off the bat and say that process and fugitive is not included in the previous 2008 inventory. And we'll go over a somewhat of a comparison discussion in a little bit about why we did not compare to 2008. But I just want to mention right now about process and fugitive emissions. So then now we get into how our greenhouse gas emissions calculated. So we use activity data multiplied by the emissions factor equals that emissions estimate. So activity data you can think of as electricity consumption and or kilowatts per hour. We then take our emissions factor. So this would be the CO2 emitted per kilowatt hour. When we take the electricity consumption that was provided by the utility, we are then take the emissions factor that is most often supplied by the utility as well, showing how much carbon dioxide is emitted per kilowatt hour. Sometimes that value sits within the 400s, sometimes it's up into the thousands. This all depends on the portfolio of the utility. If you have more renewables on the grid of that utility, that number will be lower. If you have a higher number, that means that the grid is quote unquote dirtier. So then we use activity data for all of these other ones. So we look at natural gas, gasoline, and solid waste. And again, that emissions factor where we look at CO2 and or for solid waste, we look at CH4 or methane emitted per ton of waste. And then we see those emissions are usually reported as CO2 emitted. And then for solid waste, it comes in CH4 or methane emitted. If we have any questions about activity data and emissions factors, I'm welcome to go into more detail about those, as it can also be an area that's somewhat hard to conceptualize and think about. At least I had a lot of trouble with it when I was first starting.
So Hannah, just sorry,
Yeah.
if you could go back to that slide. On
Totally.
your column where you have the emissions on the far right, right?
Yes.
The next step would then be taking that, because it's both carbon dioxide emissions and methane emissions, right? And then converting them into metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, correct?
Correct, yes. So Allison brought up a very excellent point. Right here, we have the solid waste generated in methane tons. And then that is again where we would then convert it to CO2e to make comparing those different gases across the different sectors as like, it allows like a normalization. That way we apply those global warming potentials and make sure we can compare those gases accurately across the entire community-wide jurisdictional boundary. So now we're going to get into why is a greenhouse gas inventory important? So this is a foundational element to your climate action plan. I do want to already mention here that I would assume that everyone here knows why a greenhouse gas inventory is important, simply because we've already moved forward with it. But I just want to reiterate these points because it really does take excellent leadership within the city and its partners to take this step in making a greenhouse gas inventory and really moving forward with data-driven decisions. So excellent on you guys. I really do love seeing the leadership from the Midwest. It makes me very excited and hopeful for the future. So a greenhouse gas inventory is a baseline that will allow your community to follow XYZ. So we can forecast your business as usual emissions, which I have shown in a further slide. We can create emissions reduction target goals, which we have made a science-based target, which I'll get into in the future of the presentation as well. We're able to model potential reduction scenarios, monitor emission reduction progress, make informed decisions on mitigation. And as we know, mitigation is the #1 adaptation strategy. So as we are looking at sort of emission reduction actions for the time that we are in right now between 2022 and 2030, we want to make sure that we are thinking about adaptation and resilience and equity and creating a holistic plan for reducing Grand Rapids emissions. But it's always important that we do focus on directly reducing your emissions from those sectors through mitigation reduction actions, such as replacing internal combustion engine vehicles on your roads to EVs or electrifying your buildings. So using less natural gas and potentially putting in heat pumps or something like that. Then we would want it, or a greenhouse gas inventory demonstrates accountability and leadership within your city. It also can motivate community action, and it recognizes GHG emissions performance relative to similar communities. So Grand Rapids sits within a unique position in which your greenhouse gas inventory looks extremely similar to other Midwest cities. It would allow Grand Rapids and your neighboring communities, if they have greenhouse gas inventories, to almost potentially take a regional approach and start working collaboratively on how to reduce those emissions based on comparing your greenhouse gas inventories. So then it's also just important that I want to mention ICLEI's 5 milestones for climate mitigation. So we are in this step 1, which is conducting emissions and inventory forecast. Then 2 would be setting your emissions reduction target. 3, developing that climate action plan. 4 is implementation, and then monitor and verifying those emissions reductions. So it's really important to recognize the leadership commitment that Grand Rapids has made by conducting this greenhouse gas inventory. Again, so then we're just continuing with why this is important. So we have made a science-based target. This is creating an emissions reduction target. This is measurable, actionable, and time-bound climate targets. So a science-based target is something that ICLEI produces that aligns with Earth's limits of 1.5 degrees Celsius. This shows the global need to reduce by 50% reduction by 2030 and be net zero by 2050. It factors in the Human Development Index, which takes into account societal sustainability goals, and a 2030 target that reflects a maximum effort toward or beyond a fair share of 50% of CO2 reductions by 2030. So what does that mean? It really means that when we get into the science-based target discussion, which we will in further slides, there are going to be 2 targets for Grand Rapids. There's going to be a 2030 absolute goal and then a 2030 per capita goal. That 2030 absolute goal is what is represented to meet that global need of 50% reduction by 2030 and stay within that 1.5 degrees Celsius. I was saying Grand Rapids needs to absolutely reduce by this amount between 2019 levels and 2030. Then we have our 2030 per capita. So the 2030 per capita goal is what factors in the Human Development Index and an allotted fair share, accounting for the US being so advanced and how we have just been historically emitting more than other nations. So it applies a fair share amount to all US cities to account for that equity that we need to address and how to be more equitable and just really addressing our history as a nation to move forward and take account for the amount of emissions that we have produced over the years. So then we're also going to cover why is a greenhouse gas forecast important. So this is another foundational element of your climate action plan. So ICLEI takes your your greenhouse gas inventory and we apply your emissions to a business as usual forecast scenario. So BAU or business as usual scenario is an on the books expected emissions reductions or growth before any reduction strategies have been put in place. So this factors in fuel efficiency standards for on-road vehicles. This says Excel grid decarbonization, but it's really just your utility grid decarbonization. So I have a screenshot in a later slide, which will show the amount of reduction based on the utility commitment that shows that's factored into your BAU scenario, and then household and population growth. And then in your business as usual scenario, we can then move into a further step where we would apply greenhouse gas reduction strategies, such as energy efficiency, and then those are applied to the forecasted emissions. We have not moved into this step. This is something that we can do at a different point in time.
Hannah, under your examples, you've also included as a part of that future forecast some information on the electrification of vehicles, right, for the 2030?
Correct, yes. So it includes like fuel efficiency standards, which are now starting to account for more EVs being on the road. I will say that the national data default sets that we use are provided by the federal government. So those are a little outdated. We're waiting for new ones to come in, but we are using the most up-to-date information regarding fuel efficiency standards and EV projections.
And the same is true for, I think you mentioned the electrification of buildings, right? Thinking about between now and 2030 as well.
Yes, so that is where we used I can't remember your utility's name. Is it consumers?
Consumers energy. Mhm.
Yes, okay, so with consumers, we factored in their grid decarbonization goal. So we'll see that in the screenshot of the BAU forecasted emissions. Because of consumers' goal, we actually see those emissions going down, which is extremely helpful for making any sort of reduction action strategies. So now we're going to take a short Q&A break, just because I know I word vomited a lot at all of you. So if you have any questions or want me to circle back on any topics, now's the time. Before we get into the data, there's a lot more data we will be covering.
Okay, so, and some of these, if we're going to be focused on them in the future, we can hold off, but let's see. Chad, thank you. What challenges did you face when collecting data from community providers? What did you do when the data was not available in the way that you would like from providers?
So let's see, I'm trying to think back a little bit. So we had been given, the only one that I'm thinking about right now off the top of my head is when it comes to natural gas usage. We were provided aggregated natural gas usage, and we had to break that down by zip code, where we had to apply a certain percentage to those zip code areas. Whereas it's really beneficial to just be provided the aggregated natural gas usage for the jurisdictional boundary of Grand Rapids. But that's an easy one to work through, no worries whatsoever. Then in this inventory, we use Google EIE data for on-road transportation. This is what ICLEI does recommend now moving forward for on-road transportation, as it's somewhat difficult to collect data from transportation agencies. However, so that was a seamless process, but I would just like to mention that that was data provided by Google and not provided through like a local transportation agency. But those are the two that I can mostly think about right now, has been natural gas usage being broken down by zip code. And then I think that's pretty much it. When we are given data that is not provided in the form that we are looking for, there's almost always a way that we can break that down by applying some sort of assumption to it to reach a final number. I will say that in this inventory, there aren't too many data gaps and assumptions that we addressed whatsoever. So honestly, great on all of the providers, like providing everything that we could move forward with.
Yeah, so just a few points. You'll see as we get into the results. So much of the emissions are based on actual natural gas consumption or the fugitive emissions associated with it. So we have all real information from DTE on that. And we also have all of the electricity information from consumers energy and the steam information from vicinity. And so in working with them, I think it's pretty standard. Utilities have regulations in place to protect the confidentiality of individual account holders' consumption and cost. And so we work on an aggregated basis where they essentially, just as an example, when we got electricity information, we worked with them to identify what all falls within the city of Grand Rapids proper, and they were able to take our GIS information and overlay that with their systems to only pull electricity accounts that fall within that city of Grand Rapids border, and then are able to give us the total kilowatt hours, for the year of 2019. And then they would break it down just the one step further was into the categories that ICLEI requested. So break it down and tell us the total for industry, tell us the total for consumer, for commercial, and for residential. And so that's kind of how that data came in, still on an aggregated level across the community. But I do think it's really important to be thoughtful and plan that sometimes how you get that data and how it lines up specifically to your community can impact the data that you're using. So as Hannah mentioned, with respect to DTE, we went a little bit different of a route, and we were able to identify all of the zip codes that fall within the city of Grand Rapids, and they were able to pull their data based on the zip code information. But then we knew, for instance, a couple of the zip codes might only fall 20% actually within the city of Grand Rapids boundary and 80% was outside. So we applied the ratios to the data that came specifically from those zip codes for that. I think that Hannah mentioned with respect to across the board for pretty much all the nearly all of the transportation emissions data comes from the estimates that ICLEI uses for all customers that they work with. However, I will say that we did provide real data with respect to the city government operations fleet information, which we have, as well as the dash, transit lines that we operate downtown. And then we also had data previously from working with the Rapid on the actual gallons of fuel consumed and the types of fuel and types of vehicles from the Rapid. And so we were able to use that information. And then I also just wanted to acknowledge, because Chad, I saw you asked about solid waste. So for those who might not be familiar, in Grand Rapids and our 6 kind of sister communities, we're required by contract to send all of our refuse to the Kent County Waste to Energy facility. And so I did work with Kent County, appreciation to DAR, who provided the information with respect to the amount of waste that is processed in our waste to energy facility. I was not able, unfortunately, at this time to get information with respect to some of the private compost or organics haulers. Because there wasn't really a streamlined way to get that information collected for 2019. But based on some previous studies that were done, we were able to kind of look at the total that had been identified, and it was at a fairly de minimis level where it wasn't going to have significant impact with respect to emissions generation. So that is an area where we did not include it. We did include information with respect to the city facility for yard waste that is processed at the city's Domtar facility. So we were able to include the yard waste, but not for private developers that were providing compost or organics processing.
Just two tangential points. For Google EIE information for all of your on-road transportation emissions, which you'll see makes up a very large factor within Grand Rapids. Google likes to use on-road real-time sensors to track that on-road information. And a lot of other agencies will use modeling. So within Google, we have seen that they provided a actual real-time reduction within the year of 2020 due to the pandemic, and then how we're slowly seeing that increase happen again now post-pandemic. So I do want to mention that it is using real-time sensors. And then I was going to mention one other point that Allison touched on, and I can't remember. I should have made a note, but if it comes back to me, I will mention it. But what other questions do we have?
So right now, I don't see any more open questions. So I would say let's go ahead and move into kind of the results area. And I suspect, but if others have questions about the process, feel free to drop them in here as Hannah is moving through some of the results from our data.
I just remembered it. In a community-wide inventory, the way that ICLEI moves forward with a best practice. So we have made a U.S. community protocol, which includes the 5 basic emission generating activities. Grand Rapids, we moved one step further. So we've included activities that do not fall within just those 5 areas to create a more holistic picture of what's happening. And then also within a community-wide inventory, if an activity is accounting for 5% or less of what we expect those emissions to be within a community-wide, that is where we would omit it. So circling back to Allison's point on, I believe it was like a transportation area or something, an area that is so small that would not count, that's totally okay, and best practice to leave that out.
I think, Hannah, that one was rail.
Oh, rail. That would make sense. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to get into some heavy data discussions. This is going to be pretty dense, so please plop any questions, anything you might have questions about. It can get a little heavy. I'm going to try and make it as easily digestible as possible. So first, I'm going to talk about the local government operations greenhouse gas inventory. So this inventory was not conducted with ICLEI. However, we wanted to just make a special spotlight on it and show what's happening at the local government emissions level. So we'll see that the number 1 emitter within the local government or municipal operations is electricity. That is followed by 12% of natural gas and then 10% attributed to fleet. If we look at our pie chart right here, we can see all of the different sectors with their different respective colors. So again, we have electricity at 76%, natural gas at 12%, fleet at 10%, and steam at 2%. Then I also just want to show it another way right here, where we're looking at that fueler source and then those 2019 emissions. So these are the actual 2019 emissions in CO2e that are equivalent right here. So we have electricity, where we had approximately 41,000, natural gas at 6,000, fleet at 5, steam at 1,200, and then a total for 54, almost 55,000 total emissions are attributed to just local government operations for Grand Rapids. I know Allison has mentioned that it is an extreme priority for the city to address their emissions right here and take actions to reduce these. And I can't remember their exact goals, but Allison, if you want to jump in with your goals for local government operations, I think it'd be really great for everyone to hear those.
Yeah, I put it in the chat too. This was a big shout out to Joel and Mike for helping to collect all this data with our data partners and run the analysis for specifically our municipal operations. And so we do have a goal for our municipal operations with respect to emissions reductions. It's 85% reduction by 2030. And we are comparing ourselves to our 2008 baseline. And then we're working to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040. So it is one of the, I think, most progressive goals in terms of the 85% by 2030 for in comparison to the state or to the national government, even in comparison to the UN climate accords. And so that's something that we're really proud of, and we're working hard to identify opportunities to achieve those goals.
I do want to say it is an extremely ambitious, but like excellent goal for leadership to set themselves to. This is something that we don't see a lot when it comes to other local governments within our nation. Grand Rapids is really they're really set, but at the expense of me hopefully not swearing during this because I have the worst potty mouth. However, I will say they're doing an exceptional job at setting that leadership standard to set these emission reduction goals. And I just really want to highlight that they are putting their best foot forward. And I do just really want to make sure we are mentioning the leadership that's happening at the city of Grand Rapids. So now we're going to move into the community-wide inventory results. So this first one I want to mention is that we have broken out the emissions by fuel type. And as we get into the further slides, we're going to see this broken out by sector. So it is important to mention that when we are looking at fuel type, we have our different fuel and sources. So we have natural gas, electricity, gasoline and diesel, and then also miscellaneous. So your miscellaneous includes kerosene, propane, any sort of wood, anything like that. That would be your miscellaneous emissions that we have. So natural gas has emissions, again, in CO2e, that is near 800,000. Then we have electricity that is 880,000, gasoline at 450,000, diesel at 160,000, and then miscellaneous is sitting around 230. So we see those percentage of total emissions, which is the total emissions within our community-wide inventory. We see that natural gas makes up 32%, electricity sits around 35%, gasoline is around 18%, diesel around 7%, and then miscellaneous is around 9%. So we're looking at this, we want to make sure when we're trying to understand the holistic picture that's happening is that we see electricity is the largest percentage of total emissions for a direct fuel use that is being used within the jurisdictional boundary, followed by natural gas, and then gasoline and diesel, or gasoline and then miscellaneous and then diesel. Gasoline and diesel come from the transportation emissions, and natural gas and electricity, this includes your stationary combustion. Your stationary combustion is happening like within houses or buildings, but then the natural gas is also factoring in the process and fugitive emissions. So of the 32%, 1.6% of that is attributed to the leakage that's happening within the infrastructure of the natural gas transport within Grand Rapids. So now, again, we are now looking at the community-wide inventory results on sector-based. So this is where we're looking at the community emissions at a glance. We'll see that industrial energy makes up 31% of those total emissions, then followed by transportation at 29%, and then residential energy at 27%. So we have our beautiful looking pie chart right here where we can go through all of those associated sectors, and then we are looking at those allotted percentages. So within these different sectors, this includes, so if we're looking at industrial energy, that is making up 31% of Grand Rapids community-wide emissions totals. So in industrial energy, that includes electricity contributed to industrial accounts, as well as natural gas contributed to those accounts. So within each sector, it includes different fuel types. But like I mentioned previously, ICLEI likes to move forward now with a best practice of looking at everything on a sector-based level, as it helps take away the abstractness of scope, Whereas within scope, we would see that the direct natural gas consumption would be scope 1 and the electricity consumption would be scope 2. So it's just important to recognize that there are different fuel types happening within each of these sectors. And then it's important to start looking at these as a sector-based level as we start applying different emissions reduction strategies. So I will say, I just want to mention that this inventory does represent very much of a Midwest community. I don't see any anomalies here looking at these values. Allison, you want to jump in?
I just wanted to ask, so in that light, what you just said about being representative of Midwest, is it true that industrial energy tends to be the highest with respect to the Midwest?
I mean, it definitely depends on the city. For definitely like other port cities, absolutely. Just for example, like a Wisconsin community, a lot of times it's residential, commercial, and industrial are top 3 or around those range because they use heavy amounts of natural gas. And a lot of those houses do run on propane tanks. So we see that a lot, but I do see a lot more industrial energy emissions in the Midwest, in those heavy industrial areas than I do anywhere else in the nation.
Yeah, and I was just going to share. So if you hear some of the kind of the national narrative, you may be hearing, right, like transportation emissions are taking over as the #1 source of emissions kind of in general, or if you're looking at an average across the United States, perhaps. So just wanting to point out that, you may be hearing that, but of course here we have industrial, which is a little bit higher than that when we look at that. And then you also may often hear, oh, the building sector and emissions associated with the building sector. Is often kind of identified as the top or the second largest source of emissions. And when folks say that, they typically are combining together the residential energy and the commercial energy. So if you do that here, right, you can see that it's about hovering around 30 or 35%. So building sector emissions would technically be higher than transportation. It's just the way that this inventory separates things out. It's separating out the residential from commercial. So I just wanted to kind of share if people have been hearing those things kind of more on a broad national scale, how that resonates with our local information.
I think that's really important context to add. So excellent way of describing that as well. It is important, it is important to, when you are looking, so again, this community-wide inventory does include hyper-localized data that was collected from your utility providers, from people in your community, from on-road transportation sensors. It's real-time information of what's happening within your area and your community. And then when that's compared to the national narrative, it is important just to recognize how every community is different. And here we can just see how within every jurisdictional boundary, there are different sources that are happening. And it does allow us to compare across the national averages. However, it's really important to focus on your hyper-localized information moving forward as you guys do start doing or moving into the climate action planning space. So now we're going to get into our inventory results. So I'm going to kind of briefly cover everything in here. If I need to zoom in for anything, please let me know. I know this one's like a little bit tinier of an area to read. So if we're looking at our sectors on the left, we have residential energy, commercial, industrial, transportation, solid waste, water, wastewater, processed fugitive, and then what we call AFOLU. This includes your agriculture, farming. This is also where we have our land use area. So you'll see also at the bottom, we have the total gross emissions, and then we have your total with sequestration. So that AFOLU category includes sequestration values of what's happening within Grand Rapids. So if we jump back to the top and we look at residential energy, we see that we have 2 different fuels and sources here. We have electricity and natural gas. We have their 2019 usage and or the activity data that was provided by the utilities. Then we have the usage unit. So we'll see that that has been provided in kilowatts per hour. And then I did convert to therms. I believe it was provided in a different unit, but we use a standard value as a conversion factor to convert to therms. Then we have those 2019 emissions. So again, that is all in CO2e to allow us to compare those different greenhouse gases across the board by applying those different global warming potentials. So then we also, in the green, we have all of our different total values. In commercial energy, you see that we have a few other fuels or sources. So these this distillate fuel, propane, kerosene, and wood all fell into that miscellaneous category on the previous slide. So we have electricity up here at 79,000, and then also natural gas for 79,000. So those two are pretty on par within our commercial sector. So I do want to mention, oh, we did break it out. This is a newer version of the table, I forgot to mention. So within our commercial energy sector, if we're looking at our water, wastewater down here, we see that we have wastewater energy use. So this is including the electricity that was provided to just contributing to the wastewater energy use for servicing Grand Rapids. This was originally provided in our commercial sector. So we have taken this value, or we subtracted the wastewater energy use out of commercial and applied it to the water wastewater sector just to make it a little more readable, in the sense of we can see that 22,000 kilowatts per hour is attributed to wastewater energy use, and 24,000 kilowatts per hour is attributed to the supply of potable water for our electricity usage that was normally grouped in our commercial sector and has been separated out into water and wastewater. So then we move into industrial, where we see we have electricity and natural gas accounts. Transportation, we have gasoline and diesel, which was provided by Google EIE. Then we have compressed natural gas and public transit. That information was provided by the public transit agencies. So again, that is activity data that we have. With public transit, you see that we have empty values right here. This is because when we are entering that information into ClearPath, it just doesn't allow, based on the information we had, we're not able to group it out by actual activity data. However, this is where we had to apply sort of like a fuel use standard. So I can go into more detail about how that looks if we're interested. However, I will say that in the public transit agencies, the information they provided was excellent, in the sense that we have everything we need here to have those 2019 emissions. However, it just doesn't show as the actual like activity data. So I just want to make sure we're making that abundantly clear. So then we have off-road right here as well. So that off-road information is collected through a national database called NEI. That is something that ICLEI will pull on the side to account for those emissions. For this compressed natural gas area we have right here, that is the reason it's zeroed out is because this value with the compressed natural gas and the emissions factor isn't showing a large enough usage of the compressed natural gas to account towards even like one singular emission value. So that's why it's zero. It's probably like 0.1 or like 0.5. It's just something so negligibly small there that it doesn't equate to showing a value of 1 or higher. Oops, my bad. So now if we're looking at solid waste, again, within Grand Rapids, all of the solid waste is sent to a waste to energy plant. So the combustion of solid waste generation is where we have our total short tons that were provided, and then how that converts into the emissions of 64,000. So there's no actual waste in Grand Rapids that's sitting in a landfill that emits methane just by sitting. Everything is a waste to energy facility or operation. And then within solid waste, this other category represents composting. So this is where that 1,000 value of composting is accounting for. It's just labeled under other. Oh, I keep hitting the wrong button. So in water and wastewater, again, we just see those energy usages broken out by kilowatts per hour. And then N2O and septic systems. So septic systems represent the number of septic systems within Grand Rapids jurisdictional boundary. That equates for 91 emissions. And then we have N2O. So this is accounting for the effluent discharge that's accounted for in wastewater treatment facilities, and then any sort of denitrification and nitrification processes as well. So within that area, we see about 6,000 CO2e emissions are attributed to a denitrification process or effluent discharge process. In our process and fugitive, that is where we have our natural gas distribution. So in this 18,000, or not even this 18 value, I cannot do numbers off the top of my head sometimes. Well, that is your complete aggregated use of natural gas within all of Grand Rapids. So that is in an MMBTU compared to therms, which we had used above. And then that accounts for 32,000 emissions. So again, that is 1.6% of the total 32% of natural gas within Grand Rapids jurisdictional boundary. And then in our AFOLU category, we have a small chunk of agricultural electricity, which is, we see that usage unit right there and accounts for 560 CO2e emissions. And then just because we weren't able to completely break out the tables in time, we do see that we have a total emissions with sequestration. So what we did is ICLEI uses this tool called Learn, which is where we put in a shape file that was provided by the city, and then we upload it into this tool, and then it provides information on grasslands within Grand Rapids, forest to non-forest, undisturbed forest, and provides those different sequestration values in both plus and minus, because as we're thinking about trees, we know that they release and then they also sequester CO2. So it's important that those are acknowledged and mentioned. So if we are looking at the total gross emissions within Grand Rapids, it is 2,545,523. And then the total emissions with sequestration, we see that goes down by just a little bit with our sequestration values. And now, so that was all heavy data. What questions do we have?
All right, so let's see. I know Sini was asking about whether there are emissions that could be broken down even further, I think more by specific geographic corridors. And so Hannah, can you speak to a little about that, and then I can share some information too?
Yes, so a lot of it kind of comes down to like privacy when data is provided. If we wanted to break it out by, like, let's say you wanted to break something out by blocks, it can't, like, it probably could happen, but just due to a lot of privacy things with utilities or something like that, we very rarely ever see that type of level of information. It would probably take a GIS team, really specific data, like attributed to accounts from like the natural gas and electricity providers and something like that. So it absolutely probably can be done. However, we just normally never follow that, or we never go into that level.
One thing that I would add to that is we did a project a couple years ago, and unfortunately I just haven't had the time to like wrap it all up and complete it. But we did work with consumers to get electricity consumption information anonymized, and it was only via two categories. One was residential and one was non-residential, down to the census tract level. And so we do have a little bit of that, and I'll circle back to see where we're at and if that's something that we can get shared. Now, granted, that is only specific to electricity, but that would provide us a little bit more information specific to that type of energy source that we're using. Mindy, you have a question about emissions reduction goals. We're coming to that next, so hang tight there. Another question is, did we look at SF6 emissions from breakers in the electrical distribution system?
What is SF? I don't know what SF6
emissions are. So for the person who was kind and put that in the question, if maybe provide a little bit more context for us to know, and we can try to get a better answer for that. Someone else asked if we could describe what the off-road emissions would include.
Yes, so off-road emissions would include, let's say someone's whipping around on their ATV or they're snowmobiling. It accounts for like those kind of emissions. I truthfully don't know if Grand Rapids is like on the lake or not, but it also includes any sort of like water transportation emissions or anything along those lines. But again, it's through the EPA. It's called the NEI database, in which we apply Grand Rapids area, and then it provides us with the off-road emissions based on different fuel sources. So gasoline, diesel, sort of things like that. But that would be attributed to, like I said, ATVs, snowmobiles, different kind of toys like that.
Okay, yes. And so for Grand Rapids, we're not, obviously, I think most people here, but Hannah, for your benefit, we are not located right on the lake. We're about 35 miles away. And so we don't have nearly the amount of off-road vehicle emissions that many other communities located right on the lake shore, or those that have, you know, more kind of recreation industry geared towards snowmobiling and other things, perhaps further north in Michigan, who may have more of those associated emissions. All right, so thanks to Joel, he provided clarification, and the question about SF6, as in the number 6, is the short for sulfur hexafluoride. So the question was, did we include sulfur hexafluoride emissions from breakers in the electrical distribution system?
Okay, so those, when in the industrial sector, ICLEI looks at the EPA flight tool, which would imply, or which collects data from high industrial accounts emitting emissions. In that tool, it does break out different fuel use. I do not know if SF6 is included in that EPA flight tool, but if any sort of emissions are associated with that electricity breakdown, it would be provided within that area. I truthfully was not on the project at that time to look at the data collection in that depth, but Allison, you and I can circle back on that area to make sure it has been included within the inventory. I assume it was, but I don't want to make a statement in case it hasn't been.
Yeah, so I think that's great. We'll definitely follow up. The person did put a little additional information and said more recently that more utilities are using sulfur hexafluoride, and that it is a very, very strong greenhouse gas.
Okay.
So just wanting to ensure that that's something that's being accounted for there. All right, and then there's another question asking for a little bit more discussion on fugitive emissions.
Yep.
And the chart explains that 1.6% is fugitive. And so asking, when you compare site energy to source energy in Energy Star, that the source energy is usually about double of the site emissions. And so can you help explain the difference between that and what is showing up as fugitive emissions for your inventory?
Yes. Oops. So when we are looking at the process and fugitive emissions, when we're looking at natural gas that is combusted on site, i.e. in houses and or different commercial and industrial processes, that's the site breakdown. I truthfully don't know too much about Energy Star or anything along those lines, but I will just mention that process and fugitive is the infrastructure and or the natural gas lines that is laying all within Grand Rapids. And what we do is we don't account for the miles of infrastructure that's going on underneath the city, but rather how much natural gas is transported through those lines. And then we apply a standard leakage rate. So that process and fugitive value is just really showing within the transportation of natural gas within the city of Grand Rapids. For example, from DTE to your house, how much is lost within that area. Granted, that data is not on that level, but if you think of it in that way, that is how we get the process and fugitive value, by looking at the amount of lines that are traveling within Grand Rapids and applying a standard leakage rate of 0.3%. And that's where we see how much MMBTU and or 32,000 emissions has been released just due on this annual in 2019. That's how much was released just based on the transportation of natural gas to the different sites that are there. I'm not sure if that helped really truthfully answer the question. If it didn't, we can dig in a little further detail.
Sherry, I'm wondering too, if part of the site versus source, we may need to get a little better clarification. I'd have to dig back into EPA to look at that. But I'm wondering if for the source, they may be picking up obviously emissions from the power generating facility that are kind of, I don't want to call them ancillary emissions, right? But they're using their own electricity, lights and other things for their own facilities. So I'm wondering it may be attributing a portion of that versus, Hannah, right? The fugitive emissions that you talked about is truly just the amount of gas that's being consumed by accounts in Grand Rapids, right? And the amount that would be released within the city of Grand Rapids geographical boundary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do. So one thing, I'm actually just checking another screen right now. So if I'm correct, my other colleague who had been working on this project before I jumped onto the project has a record within your greenhouse gas inventory titled Electric Power Transmission and Distribution Losses from Consumers' Energy. I'm not sure if this completely applies to that sort of question, but it's been marked as information only simply because we don't want to account for an overestimation of emissions, but there are emissions attributed to electric power transmission and distribution losses for electricity as well.
Okay.
Mhm.
One other question that came in, and I don't know if we have the answer to this, but Hannah, you might have a good sense. It says, how does Grand Rapids compare with other communities in terms of sequestration? And I'm going to venture to assume or make the assumption that this is with respect to green space and tree canopy versus other technologies that are being tested with respect to sequestration.
Absolutely. I truthfully will say I see there are some areas that have been, like, especially in the Pacific Northwest, we see a lot more sequestration values. Within our Midwest communities, a lot of them, Grand Rapids, as I mentioned, honestly, numerous times at this point with the leadership standard, a lot of our Midwest communities opt not to know their sequestration values. However, I can imagine that this sequestration value is not horrible, but it's also not great. I think there can definitely be a lot of improvements on the tree canopy within Grand Rapids based on these sequestration values. And then also just looking at potential of like rewilding different areas within the city. One caveat of the Learn tool is it uses 30 by 30 meter data. So it's great for what it does. It's one of the best tools that we have out there. However, there aren't any other tools that really provide like 1 meter by 1 meter information. But I will mention that part of the Google EIE or Environmental Insights Explorer tool that we collected our transportation data from is releasing a tree canopy data tool as well. So pretty soon that will be available, and then we can take that Learn tool information and compare it to what Google is saying. And how Google collected that information is they have been using pixel by pixel information to identify what their AI recognizes as a tree. And then they overlay that information within the jurisdictional boundary of the city, and we'll be able to see the different areas within Grand Rapids that have high tree canopy and low tree canopy. And then just addressing an equity portion of that, they'll also be adding a heat island effect. So it'll help the city identify where they can do more plantings and where they have excellent plantings so far to further boost that tree canopy value. If I'm also not mistaken, the city of Grand Rapids has a goal to have 40% tree canopy. So there's definitely room for improvement in the sequestration area. So I think it's an important reduction strategy that the city could address.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. I just wanted to confirm, we have had on the books for quite some time a tree canopy goal of 40%. And we currently, the last time we measured, we're at 34%. And so that is one of the key metrics that we've looked at and understand and recognize the importance of that with respect to not only greenhouse gas mitigation, which is very important, but also Hannah brought up urban heat island and other benefits that tree canopy bring in from an adaptation perspective with respect to stormwater and bringing down heat, providing shade and comfort on extreme heat days and things of that nature. So let's see, we have one other question. This one I think is mostly for me. So somebody was asking about, we have a Grand Rapids cannabis ordinance, and it does require a sustainability plan for any cannabis facility, retail or grow, that is getting a license in the city of Grand Rapids. And so there's a question about plans to expand that or making that voluntary across the community. I think you mean beyond just the cannabis industry. And so I think that I don't have an answer for that right now, but definitely something to be thinking about. And I think the point, or one of the benefits of having this data, especially right now that we know the industry portion was so big, one of the questions that came in my mind was trying to think, okay, well, what component of those industry emissions are coming from the cannabis industry in particular? And so as a part of that licensing requirement, we do have those industries participating in the 2030 district. So we'll have the opportunity after they've been in operation for 12 to 18 months to be able to look and confirm the amount of energy being consumed and have a better understanding of specific to the cannabis industry out of the total industry. emissions category, what that might look like. But those are some of the things I'm going to share a little bit more comments on at the very end about kind of the next steps for the city and looking at our climate plan and identifying strategies and opportunities to address the data that we've received through the emissions inventory.
I will also mention, so I do live in Colorado, so cannabis industry here has been around for quite some time. I do see an increased level of industrial related emissions with cannabis industry, especially within like our different counties and everything like that. So I would attribute a decent portion of the industrial emissions to cannabis grow houses and retail and everything like that. Again, it does completely depend on how their rate is classified based on the utility. So like their rate class and everything. But I do see just on a national standard, increased industrial emissions with the cannabis industry.
And I should just say too, I wanted to provide clarification that those emissions are specific to any indoor grow operation. So there's also been growth with respect to kind of indoor greenhouses and other opportunities to address food deserts and things within a community. So it's not something that necessarily is specific to just cannabis, but with respect to the amount of energy that is needed when you have kind of an enclosed greenhouse system here. All right, I think that looks like all the questions that we have right now. We'll come back to the goal question here after Hannah has a chance to go over the last component of her presentation.
Excellent. So we're going to go over one or a few more areas. So SBT-HIA stands for Science-Based Target or High Impact Action. So this is a science-based target, high impact action summary that ICLEI produces after we have a completed community-wide greenhouse gas inventory. So this, I'm just going to start by going across all these different areas right here. So we have the science-based target and emissions goals. This is our base year of 2019. So when we are looking at any of these emissions and the forecasted emissions after that, I just want to recognize that it's at 2019 levels is how we're comparing, not 2022. So this is where I was talking about earlier when we have the two reduction targets. So we have our 2030 per capita goal of 62.8%. This is asking Grand Rapids to reduce their emissions by 62.8% from 2019 levels to 2030 by 62.8%, which is based on a per capita value. So again, this includes our Human Development Index factored in, and then also being a US community. So applying that fair share value, which is why we see that it's higher than the 2030 absolute value. So the 2030 absolute value is asking Grand Rapids to reduce their complete community-wide emissions from 2019 levels by 60.5%. So if there's any importance that I'm really going to talk about or that you guys take away from this portion of the presentation, it's that to align with the 1.5 degrees Celsius set by the Paris Accords to align with keeping Earth as a livable space, everyone needs to do their fair share, and applying a community-wide reduction of 60.5% is the absolute value that Grand Rapids needs to meet to align with that 1.5 degrees of warming. So these two values are extremely crucial, and I just want to make sure that I'm being abundantly clear when describing them. And if anyone has any questions, again, I can totally reiterate what I just said. So we're looking here now at these baseline scope 1 and 2, and then 2030 scope 1 and 2. So these are your emissions in metric tons of CO2e, and then the metric tons of CO2e for 2030. So this is factoring in emissions reductions, and then also like fuel efficiency standards, EV replacement, everything like that. I do want to mention that this does not include any projected temperature increases. So it also doesn't include any sequestration values. So everything that is represented here within this science-based target high impact action summary is strictly based on what has been reported within the greenhouse gas inventory and doesn't include any sequestration, doesn't include any projected temperature increases, and everything within this summary uses national data defaults. So it's really important to recognize that this is not hyper-localized information. And it also just sets an ideal for like, this is what you guys should be looking at. It's like a pathway to reach that way, but it should not be used as a strict planning document. It's more so think of it as like a guiding principle. It's something to help you think of ideas when you're starting to look at reduction action strategies. So now we're going to move into growth rates. So this 6.3% annual growth value was provided by the city through, I believe it was MDOT is what they use. And then this grid decarbonization value where we have CES, that stands for Clean Energy Standard. So this is based on national standards. This is what we see as a national average for what utilities are voluntarily committing to. So this does not include consumers' voluntary commitment. In our BAU forecast, that is where we have consumers' voluntary commitment. In a further slide, we'll see that I do recommend like an additional project after this, which would then include hyper-localized information, factor in consumers' voluntary commitment, and look at more of what's exactly happening within the ecosystem of Grand Rapids. And again, I just want to make sure I'm abundantly clear that this science-based target high impact action summary is based on national defaults, national data sets that are provided. And again, before I get into these forecasted emissions, I just want to make sure I'm driving home the point that it's very important of everything from this summary. These reduction targets is what we mostly want to focus on. So in these growth rates, we'll see that in the commercial, residential, industrial, and transportation sector, we applied the population growth value at 6.36%. And for grid decarbonization, we look at a minus 80%. So in a science-based target high impact action summary, we only address fuels. We address the commercial, residential, industrial, and transportation sectors. However, industrial, we see here that it includes your emissions, but we don't actually have any reduction strategies simply because every industrial area is very different. It'd be extremely difficult to apply sort of different reduction strategies to industry as a whole. So that's why we're not able to apply those in a further slide. So I just want to make sure that we see that fuels for industrial are included here, but we'll see later on that it's difficult to include those values. So if we're looking here, these are your baseline and forecasted emissions for all of our different sectors right here. So we have baseline emissions in metric tons of CO2e. So that, again, this is converting all of our gases that have been emitted to CO2e to make them comparable across the board. We see the percent of that adjusted total. So the percent of total adjusted just again reiterates like this science-based target high impact action summary does not include solid waste. We do not apply different reduction strategies to that. Instead, we just look at these normal 3 heavy hitters for the sectors. So we see fuels and commercial is 14%. We see the largest sector right here is on-road transportation. So this is where that aligns with that national narrative and saying here that on-road transportation is one of your largest emitters. However, we can see here that if we look at industrial for electric and fuels, we see that that value, I cannot do math in my head. What is that? 28, so 1% higher. So we see there that industrial does represent a higher value than transportation. It's just chunked out into 2 areas based on fuels or natural gas, and then your electricity consumption. This 2030 forecasted emissions in metric tons is when we're just applying a business as usual. So this is factoring in fuel efficiency standards, sort of like a little bit of a grid cleaning. The actual CES is where we're getting into this modeled emissions. So that's not truly forecasted into this 2030. So I just want to make sure that's also clear. And then when we move into the modeled emissions, so after applying those high impact action summary, those high impact actions, so this is where we apply that clean energy standard. This is where we apply different reduction actions. So if we're looking at fuels and residential, we see that is zeroed out. So that means that to align with the 1.5 degrees Celsius and meet that 2030 absolute goal, we applied a 100% reduction of electrifying and or efficiency standards to the fuels within residential. So this would be your natural gas consumption within your residential sector. And again, I just want to make sure that I'm, again, just being abundantly clear, this is based on national data defaults. It's not hyper localized information other than your emissions that are in here. And then if we're looking at Grand Rapids emissions profile, we see we have our baseline values, 2030 BAU, and then 2030 model. So this is where we have fuels commercial. This would be your commercial electricity, fuels residential, residential electricity, and then industrial and on-road. So we can see how the baseline values, the BAU values, and model values, how they stack up against each other in a bar chart form.
So Hannah, sorry, can you go back for a minute?
Absolutely.
I just want to take a minute as so the way that I'm kind of looking at this, because Hannah is our technical expert, and a few things that I just wanted to clarify and reiterate. I think she did a really good job, but this is super important, right? So if we're at the top and you're looking at those growth rates in your grid decarbonization, that negative 80%, that is based on a national average. That is not based on any commitment that Consumers Energy has made. So I just want to be really, really clear there that in order for us to try to do some updated numbers that would take into consideration Consumers Energy voluntary commitments would cost more money and be a second phase of analysis to be done. And so when we're thinking about, and when you're looking at under your baseline and forecasted emissions, right? If you put your cursor, Hannah, on the 2030 forecasted emissions columns, just so everybody knows, right? The only things that are being taken into consideration for that column are the projected population growth, the national average for decarbonization of electricity, and some components around kind of like fuel efficiency with respect to electrification of vehicles from a national perspective as well, right?
Correct. Yes, 110%.
Okay, so that's what that column is based on. And then if you go to the right under the modeled emissions, right, this is where ICLEI is kind of saying, based on their expertise and looking at things just more from a higher level perspective, right? Not necessarily getting into the intricacies of like local government, state government, utility commitments, and a number of other variables that can significantly impact the ability to achieve a zero in any of these areas. They're just kind of charting a path to look at, to think about that could help you achieve these goals, right? And so when it says fuels commercial and fuels residential, fuels here means natural gas predominantly, because we don't really have very many other fuels. And so that is indicating that our commercial buildings and our residential buildings would become fully electrified, which means there would be no natural gas going to any of our residential buildings or any of our commercial buildings. Now, I will be the first to tell you, unfortunately, that is impossible in Grand Rapids right now for a plethora of reasons that we can get into at future discussions. But that is what that is saying, right? Like we would fully electrify those buildings. And so those numbers would be decreased all the way to zero, right? And so I'm looking at a couple of your others. Now, you did not include that under fuels industrial, and that's because a lot of industrial processes actually still need to burn natural gas, whether it's, I don't know, smelting or just different types of industrial processes still require natural gas. And then if you look at on-road transportation, that's where you can see the estimates being included for reductions for looking at efficiency of vehicles and some electrification of those vehicles as well. And so that I just wanted to kind of provide, that's how I look at this data to think about it. And that's where, you know, these will be kind of next steps, but we'll talk a little bit about having more conversations with community and stakeholders who are interested on this. And then I just wanted to confirm though, Hannah, when you look at the HIAs, you're saying in total, based on what you put in this modeled emissions, it's a 47% reduction, which I'm going to assume that's an absolute, right, reduction?
Yes, if you were to apply all of these, like if you were to zero commercial and fuels, it would be an overall 47% reduction. So I just want to make, I'm bringing it back to this baseline scope 1 and 2 in 2030 1 and 2 is that, again, this sum of primary sectors does not include solid waste or the electricity from your agricultural use or something like that.
We did see that those are pretty low, like less than 3%, I think, in total. So when we're thinking about the heavy hitters, but I also just wanted to highlight, right, these things, which I suspect many of you are like, that's crazy, right? Or like, how possible is it to get to 0 in how many years we got, like 7.5, right? But even if that were to be achieved, it would only accomplish a 47% emissions reduction, right? Whereas the science-based target that ICLEI has recommended for us, which I'm just going to continue to refer to the per capita because I believe that we need to be responsible for all the reasons that she said, right? Well, that's not even getting us to the 62.8%. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that and level set as to where we're at in the data that's being shared.
Absolutely. I also do just want to make it abundantly clear that when we are making these, we do not factor in any sort of constraints that the local government is working within. So just reiterating on Allison's point that Grand Rapids is operating within a complete different set of barriers and constrictions than, like, let's say a Colorado community or a California community. You know what I mean? Like, we use the national data defaults here and apply a standard all the way across. However, there are different communities who experience much harder barriers to cross than others, just based on different preemptions, state and local utility cooperation, and then everything along those lines that can make it more difficult to reach these science-based target and high impact action goals.
So Hannah, I just want to do a time check. I think we have about 9 minutes. How many slides do you have left?
I think like 2. So I'll go a little bit faster.
Yep, because we have some questions too. So I want to get to those.
Okay, perfect. So this is the last portion of the science-based target and high impact action summary. These are the different actions that we applied to those 2030 modeled emissions. So we'll see that grid decarbonization is that clean energy standard, which is a minus 80%. We applied a high level VMT reduction. So that's saying we're going to reduce VMT by 5% or vehicle miles traveled. So that would be including more walking and biking and just essentially reducing our use of cars. We have on-road electric vehicle adoption. That would be saying we'd have a moderate growth rate of 4.5% annual growth per year. And then for all of our buildings here, that would be applying the new energy code plus electrifying like 10% of your existing building stock or 11% of your existing building stock. When we look down here at this 2030 outlook, that is where we have that 2030 absolute and 2030 per capita. And we see those values right here. By applying those high impact actions, we see a reduction achieved. So if you were to follow this like Bible, somehow you're able to get 0% fuels commercial, 0% in residential, you would meet this target. Again, this is just a pathway. It's a guiding thing. It's not supposed to be used as we need to do this, but more so, okay, this is where we should focus. So now this is one area that I actually get a little more excited about because the science-based targets and high impact action summary really is just a tangential piece of information, but this BAU forecast is hyper localized. So when we are looking at this BAU forecast, it's a projection of your emissions through 2030. This applies your population growth that was provided to the city through MDOT, changes in fuel efficiency, and changes to the carbon intensity of grid electricity. So this includes consumers' voluntary commitment. If we are looking at this BAU forecasted emissions up here, there is a 16% reduction from 2019 levels to 2030, just based on those values. So fuel efficiency standards and consumers' voluntary commitment, we already see a 16% reduction. So honestly, a great jumping off point for what you guys can work within. And all of these layered on areas of commercial, industrial, everything like that are your actual emissions being represented in colors from your inventory. So this is a visual representation of what's going on within your community and showing that a BAU forecast shows a 16% reduction from 2019 to 2030 levels. So now just some wrapping up key takeaways. The city of Grand Rapids is extremely comparable to other Midwest cities. We'll see that industrial energy is the largest emitting sector, and navigating this area to reduce those emissions will be difficult. I just want to make it, I don't want to sugarcoat it. It will be hard to reduce those industrial emissions, but we can work on that through relationship building and other sort of ways, and hopefully we can start reducing some of those emissions that are happening. On-road transportation is the second largest sector, or 27% of emissions within Grand Rapids. So ICLEI suggests sort of this is where that reduction strategies are coming in. I really sort of suggest different policies and programs such as like cash for clunkers. So if someone was to bring in an internal combustion engine, maybe the city provides like a 2,000 rebate towards an EV. We have increased EV charging availability. So having the city strategically place EV chargers somewhere to help reduce range anxiety can lead to an increase in EV uptake. And then also reducing vehicle miles traveled through the development of transit-oriented development projects. So kind of thinking of how you would layer commercial businesses, and then you have individuals living in like a high density apartment building above that area so they can walk everywhere. So you don't have to use your car to get everywhere that you'd want. That's what transit-oriented development projects kind of are. Then when we're looking at stationary combustion or natural gas, that is 32% of the total inventory, very similar to other cities within your biome and region. To reduce that natural gas usage, we recommend focusing on residential and commercial building retrofits, so electrifying or retrofitting existing building stock, and then also electrifying through the use of heat pumps. So the city could provide a sort of heat pump rebate program or something along those lines to help push the use of heat pumps. I also want to mention here that with the passage of IRA, there is EECBG funding that will become available to cities and counties, which will help cities offer these sort of heat pump rebate programs. So that's something that we can discuss further also based on population, everything like that. And then I just want to mention, due to the uniqueness of Grand Rapids, we do recommend that the city would follow up with a wedge analysis. So this would be a future project where ICLEI will work, like we've already been working with Allison closely. We will get close on a whole nother level in the sense of we will be looking at the hyper localized information within Grand Rapids to an extreme. We would be future forecasting and looking at 15 policies and programs and modeling those different reductions and how we can show the city a pathway forward, an actual pathway, not a science-based target high impact action pathway, but an actual pathway that accounts for the barriers and constraints that Grand Rapids is working in, and identify those strategies so that it can save time for staff and provide a pathway forward to meet that science-based target to align with the with the 1.5 degrees warming. I know I went extremely fast. So just our last piece, the key principles. It is really critical for cities to set a 2030 science-based target. Planning should incorporate rapidly changing trends. So thinking about how your area is going to become warmer in the next few years, what kind of hazards are you going to be encountering? Taking a holistic approach, so including health, resilience, and equity, making sure we're not just focusing on mitigation and applying a whole holistic lens to everything we're working in. Local governments can't do this alone. It's really important to make sure that we are collaborating with state utilities, with the state and utilities. It's essential to moving forward. And then inventories provide the foundation to make data-driven decisions and be transparent. However, we need to make sure we're moving past just the planning phase and actually working on implementation. And then, yeah, thank you. My name is Hannah. I'm a program officer at ICLEI. You can email me with any questions, and then that's my LinkedIn in case you're interested. But I will stop sharing my screen so we can ask any sort of questions in our last few minutes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hannah. We do just have a few minutes. So for those of you who are interested, I'm going to try to quickly answer some of the questions here. I'm happy to stay on a little after if you have follow-up questions or clarifications, but let me go quickly through these. So I think she talked about the science-based target that was established. So somebody asked, how would that result or inform our purchasing decisions? So right now, if you're talking about the purchasing of electricity or renewable electricity, I think that has a lot of impact. But something that individual organizations and something definitely the municipal government is looking at in terms of renewable energy. Broader purchasing is not something that has been included in terms of that conversation at this point. What's the cost to have the inventory done by ICLEI? So there are kind of two pathways you can go. A community of our size, I think our annual membership is around $2,500. As a part of that, you have access to the ClearPath tool, where if you go out and collect all of your data and put it into the tool, you can create your own numbers. However, I did not have the capacity to do that. So we actually went a little beyond that, and we paid a total of $6,500 to have ICLEI actually input the data into ClearPath for us and be the key partner asking for the data and running through some things with that as well, and creating a report, which we will have out soon. There are a couple things we're finalizing in that report, and we'll be sending that out as well. So the question on efficiency standards, commercial and residential buildings. So if you saw in one of Hannah's last slides for the high impact areas, it did account for the most recent IECC building codes at the state level, which applies to new construction and major renovation. It also accounted for 10% efficiency increases for existing commercial and residential buildings. Okay, and then there was a question about electrifying your own home, but a question about if you move toward electrification right now, would your carbon footprint increase due to the current makeup of the grid? So I think the answer is actually yes, but we're at a very close tipping point in terms of as consumers continues to provide more renewable energy on their grid and decarbonize the electricity that they are providing to us. This is true both with respect to vehicles as well as electrifying your home or a building. That gives you the opportunity in the long term that the emissions associated with your vehicle or your home will be decreased and, you know, at the same rate that they are decreasing. But if I got a 100% electric vehicle right now, I do think that the emissions today would be greater than burning gasoline in my vehicle. But I think that, I know I'm going to try to keep my car for 10 years. And by that time, I think that we'll actually have switched and get to the point where the emissions are lower based on it being run on electricity than on natural gas. And I see the same thing happening with respect to buildings. I think those were all the questions there. And so I want to give Kayla a moment to do some closing comments. I had actually a couple other closing things just really quickly for those of you that are hanging on. Huge thank you. The city's next step, right? Emissions inventory is one component. We also have a great report that was done by GLESA identifying the science-based climate projections for us in Grand Rapids. So we know increased temperature, increased precipitation. We'll be doing some education on that in the future so that we can be understanding this is emissions as a point in time, but we need to understand how increased temperature is going to make, everybody probably use more air conditioning and electricity in the future. And so we are then probably Annabelle on our team is leading up our climate action and adaptation plan. So completing this emissions inventory is crucial as a component of the mitigation strategies. So we're going to be taking this information and creating some task forces. So we know one is with respect to buildings, one's with respect to transportation. So the buildings work that we are doing at the city is through the Equitable, Healthy, and Zero Carbon Building Initiative, E.H.Zero. So that's where we have been working and will continue to work on identifying what strategies are possible to reduce emissions associated with residential and commercial buildings. But we have some opportunities to do more engagements, particularly around transportation and industry as being two key areas. So hopefully you are on our e-newsletter distribution list. If not, let me know. We'll get you signed up because we're providing information about how you can continue to engage on those topics as we move forward with that. So I think those were the main items. And so I want to turn it over to Kayla for closing remarks there. And just once again, say, Hannah, thank you so much for all of the work and your expertise in working with us on this.
Yeah, thank you to you both. That was a lot of information, a lot of data. We were very excited to hear about all of this and to see what we can do with this data as well. So we will be digesting this as the 2030 district and discussing amongst our team and with the city and the report collective and our whole partnership, about how we can decarbonize Grand Rapids. So looking forward to see the progress with that. But I know we're at time, so our next webinar is on November 16th, and we'll be back in the Healthy Building webinar series on the Passive House Institute of the US. And then this one will be recorded and will be on our YouTube channel, hopefully, pretty shortly. And then the slides will be available. Hannah's contact information is out there, and then we can get Allison's contact information and our follow-up email as well if you have any remaining questions. So again, a huge thank you to you both, and I hope all of you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.